So we're talking about the sermon that was delivered to children by the Rev Dr Bernard Randall at a fee-paying boarding school. This actually happened 2 years ago, but he's now been reported to prevent, which is those who are at risk or those who perhaps perpetuate radicalisation. Police investigated a tip-off on this sermon, but advised the school that he posed no counter-terrorism risk or risk of radicalisation. Well, what was it all about? It was about a sermon that he delivered where he actually was exceptionally kind, exceptionally reasoned, but there was some of it where he spoke about how children do not need to accept LGBT ideology. He also talks a lot about Brexit and a lot about the Muslims who protested outside the Birmingham school around the No Outsiders programme, and was really kind, actually, in the way he said, look, we all need to be tolerant, we all need to listen to each other. But it was particularly the part about the ideology of being LGBT that I think is the problematic part. I don't know. I wasn't the person that reported him. I happen to think the fact that he was reported to an anti-radicalisation organisation is absolutely, utterly absurd. However, I don't agree with that part of the sermon. And to debate that, and someone who maybe for the first time I'm going to properly disagree with, I'm not sure. Maybe there'll be a little bit of nuance and we'll end up coming together at the end. Calvin Robinson, the Conservative commentator, coming back to the programme. How are you, Calvin?
Good evening. It's great to be back here, Cristo. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Now, you are a man of faith yourself, aren't you?
I am indeed, yes, Christian.
And are you, am I right in saying, forgive me if I'm wrong, but are you a pastor yourself as well?
I'm not. No, I'm actually reading theology at the moment. I'm in my college room right here at Oxford, studying. So one day I might be a pastor.
Okay, love the Union Jack pillow, by the way, beautiful. Or either that or Ginger Spice has left her dress on your bed, Calvin. I don't know. I won't ask which it is.
Not in seminary.
Now, let's talk about the bits we can agree on first, Calvin, because I presume, like me, you think that this ended up going to prevent the anti-radicalisation organisation and that the police were given a tip-off about this is absurd.
Absolutely. This shows that the headmistress herself is probably an extremist. If she thinks that the very moderate sermon, and it's a wonderful sermon, by the way, if she thought that that was extreme, I think that shows her own personal prejudices and her own personal biases. Imagine shopping a vicar to prevent the anti-terrorist unit for preaching Christian values in a Christian school. Let's not forget that message right there. It was a Christian school with a Christian ethos. And he wasn't even coming down hard in line with Christian values. He was just saying, you know what, you might agree with this, you might not agree with this. Some people think this, other people think that. And I think that's quite a balanced approach to take. I actually think that this sermon is fantastic in so many ways. I can understand the bit you disagree with and why you do, but even you've admitted that, you know, he's not coming down hard against LGBT stuff, as he calls it. He's saying quite clearly, you're entitled to keep those ideas, but you should not feel required to change based on someone else's ideas. And I love that.
See, it's that word I don't like. I don't mind if he had said, and again, you know, I am looking at this from, well, there are a number of angles. I'm looking at it from what it is like to be a young person, perhaps one of those young people that heard this sermon, or other people that might be listening to this radio station now. And it's the idea that being LGBT is an ideology. It's the idea that being a young gay girl or boy, young man or woman, that it can be comparable to something like Muslim values, which are, of course, a choice, or Brexit, which is a couple of the comparisons that he makes about that. There's one particular paragraph where he says, where he talks about the fact that you can have ideas in conflict, and he says when there are areas where there are two sets of ideas are in conflict, and in these areas you do not have to accept the ideas and ideologies of LGBT activists. Indeed, since Trent exists to educate boys and girls according to the Protestant and evangelical principles of the Church of England, anyone that tells you you must accept contrary principles is jeopardizing the school's charitable status, and therefore its very existence. You should no more be told you have to accept LGBT ideology than you should be told you must be in favour of Brexit or must be Muslim. To both of which I'm sure you would rightly object. That's the part, those two lines. The rest of it, you're quite right, I think is really reasoned and balanced, and I certainly wouldn't read this and think that this guy has a deep-rooted homophobia, but it's the idea that you can compare someone's sexual orientation, which is not a choice, to something like Brexit or being a Muslim, which is a choice. You didn't choose to be straight, Calvin, so you know that isn't a choice.
I don't think that's what he's doing, Cristo. I think you're conflating two different points. So near the start of it, he says, there are some aspects of this program which are simply factual, that same-sex people are attracted to same-sex people in our society. And he says that you shouldn't discriminate against people because of that. So that's one thing. So being gay is one thing. And then he goes on to talk about LGBT activism and LGBT ideology, which is something else. So he's not saying that being gay is an idea. He's saying some people are gay. That's okay. We still have to love them. We have to love everybody. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. Some people just are. And then he goes on to talk about the ideology, which is, which is still being debated and discussed. Until recently, we were prescribing puberty blockers to children. Okay, that's part of the LGBT ideology. These activists are pushing these ideas, and he's saying, well, you might agree with them, but you might not. And it's still a conversation that's being had. So it's okay to disagree with that publicly. And you shouldn't be discriminated against for disagreeing, especially if you're disagreeing for a reason of faith, because your faith is a protected characteristic under the law.
But is that therefore a conflict? Because I personally have always believed, and again, I come from this as a passionate gay fella, and sometimes perhaps I'm a little bit clouded by that, because I know it's not a choice. I know that my God, for years I could have tried for goodness knows how long to not make it a choice, and it really isn't. Just as you know that you're being heterosexual is not a choice for yourself. But the problem is that when you have these two conflicting I don't want to say ideas, because what I don't believe is an idea. I don't believe that religion can always be in the same category as sexual orientation when it comes to protected characteristics, because one is an idea, is a decision, is a choice, and it's a brilliant choice, and it's a choice I respect people having, but one isn't.
But again, he's not saying that your sex or your sexuality, rather, he's not saying that is a idea. What he's saying are ideas are, for example, he talks very specifically about them. The idea that that people say that gender is independent of biology, but the same people say that a person's physiology should be changed to match his or her claimed gender. Like, it's incoherent. It doesn't match. He also goes on to say that people say that, make claims about being non-binary or gender fluid at the same time as affirming and denying gender stereotypes. So we know that these things don't make sense.
Is that the problem actually here, Calvin? Because I wonder whether, what I've just written in big letters on my pad is LGB and then plus T, because for me, some of what you're saying about what's happening within the trans debate, and again, I stress, as I know you do, if you are trans, I have every, you live how you want to live. It's great as far as I'm concerned. But there is something of a conflict between those people who are perhaps born lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and they have a sexual attraction. They have an attraction based on sex. And then what's happening within the transgender debate, where it's much more about gender. It's much more about whether you have an identified gender that doesn't match your sex. And is there a conflict by all of those letters being together where perhaps this is getting confused?
There is some of that. I'm just pointing out the trans issue because it's easier to differentiate. There are lots of activists out there pushing really hard for things that the majority of people don't agree with. And I'm talking, when I say that, I mean things like prescribing puberty blockers to young children and things like that. I'm saying, trying to say that gender is non-binary at the same time as affirming and denying stereotypes. But sexuality does come into this debate as well. So what he's saying is you're not transphobic or homophobic if you don't agree with what these activists are pushing. So if you want to bring in one of the issues around homosexuality, again, he's not saying that sexuality is an idea, but what he's saying is that within our faith, within Christianity, marriage is a sacrament that is reserved for lifelong exclusive union between a man and a woman. Now, some people might say that that is homophobic, and he's quite clearly saying that no, that is just one of our core beliefs, that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's not saying that that his faith is, or our faith is, anti-homosexuality. It's just saying that this is a sacrament that is designed around this for a very specific reason, and and it's okay to have that belief because it's enshrined in English law. Therefore, it's not something that should be referred to the anti-terrorist unit for
well on that bit I agree. I think referring it to the anti-terrorist bit is absolutely ridiculous, and I want no part of any gay activists, lesbian activists, or anything whatsoever that would think that that would be suitable. I wouldn't use that language. I mean, I understand the point you're making. I respect the point you're making. It's not language that I feel is particularly helpful to use to children, especially when you consider that it's really the difference between what is ideology and what is orientation. And I think that by reading that, you are given the impression that being gay, whether that's what he meant or not, is an idea like Brexit or being Muslim. And I think that there lies the problem. If he was to say and actually use the word activism, you do not need to agree with the extreme LGBT activism around this, or you do not need to accept the activism around this, there I wouldn't have a problem. But I think that the language he uses specifically, where, again, I'll repeat what I've said, he's bringing in things like Brexit or being a Muslim, and that you should not be told that you must be in favour of Brexit or being a Muslim, both of which I'm sure you would rightly object. That sounds like you almost have a carte blanche to object to the existence of gay people. I don't know whether it's just a language thing, but that's the part I think that it gives a grey area.
Because in that paragraph you're quoting, he used the term LGBT ideology, but further on down, he clarifies it by saying LGBT activists. So he's quite clearly talking about a political movement. He's not talking about gay people or trans people or bi people. I thought that was quite clear. Maybe he could have been more clear. But if you take it in good faith that he's not talking about people's sexuality or their orientation, and he's actually talking about the activist the political movement to push this agenda, would that make you more likely to agree?
If it was, if he'd used slightly more moderate language. I don't really like as well the question that he started with. How come we are told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school, which I know a child put to him and he's repeating it. Again, I'm just putting myself in the position of a young person who might be struggling with their sexuality, who is in that school, hearing that. And I just think that in the back of his mind, bearing in mind it's an establishment for education, I respect what you're saying, that it's a Christian establishment for education, he could have been a bit more mindful with his language. Does that mean he should have been reported to Prevent? Absolutely not. But I think you need to be mindful that there might be a young gay person listening to that.
Yeah, I think I could take your point on that. I didn't see it from that perspective, but maybe he could have been more explicit. But a lot of it is, like you say, around the trans issue. And he goes very clear into things like, human beings are indeed male and female. Your sex can't be changed. There are two sexes. And we have things in common, but we also have some very real biological based differences between the two genders. And that right there is a statement that used to be considered fact and now is considered a belief. But I just stand by the entire principle of this document, this sermon, that says that is an okay belief to have. And if you have that belief, especially in a Christian school, you should be allowed to have that and not be called any kind of phobe or any kind of ism.
Do you think, by the way, I respect where you're coming from, and in fact, if perhaps more of us had more conversations like this, we wouldn't have some of these issues where people feel that they need to report others, because you know what, you can have conversations. We've sort of managed to come halfway. You've acknowledged some of the language was wrong. I've acknowledged that, you're right. Perhaps there is a bit of activism he's talking about. And perhaps if the head teacher had had this kind of conversation with him as well, it wouldn't have ended up being reported to an anti-terror group, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
I know.
Do you think that if it had been another faith that had delivered a sermon like this, that it would have been overlooked?
Of course it would, because the Christian faith is one of the most persecuted faiths in the world right now, and it's an easy target in the West because this used to be a Christian country, and I mean, technically it still is, but it's become so secularized that it's okay to, because we've always allowed mocking of our own, and we absolutely should allow mocking of our own, but we've always been very careful about mocking others. And it's gotten to a point now that certain faiths are allowed to be mocked and others aren't. And I don't think that's right. That's not equal. And under our law, everyone should be equal. I like the way he ends his sermon, by the way, by saying the most important thing is to remember loving your neighbor as yourself. That is the most important, that's one of the two most important.
And he also says, again, and it's just these sorts of little bits of words that I'm finding a little bit troubling. We should all respect that people on each side of the debate have deep and strongly held convictions. And again, I get that, and he's right, and that's lovely. And he says that we should respect it, and it's an ongoing process, and there should be a shared effort to find what the real truth looks like. But if you were someone listening to that who perhaps can't explore the nuance that you and I have, it might be perceived that being LGBT or being gay specifically is a conviction. And it's only that part that I desperately don't want a young person hearing that and thinking, well, hang on, so being gay is a conviction. Oh, hang on, being gay is an idea. I get what you're saying. It's about the ideas of the activism, and it's about the convictions of the activists, and perhaps it's about the way in which the activists go about things. I didn't always get that.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is a conversation starter. It's all about saying we are allowed to debate these things. Like you said, it's an ongoing process. He says there's no excuse for personal attacks or abusive language. And this is the start of a conversation. This would be, pupils should be able to talk to him and talk to the teachers about this, rightly so. And what we saw instead was a shutting down of the entire debate, because one side of the argument, as he would call it, the LGBT ideology, or the activist, shut him down and said, no, it's not okay. I find it fascinating because he's talking in line with the school's principles, and the headmistress has actually gone against the Christian ethos. So I'd love to see what happens next. I think she's got a history of this.
Do you think, just on a general note, and I sort of related to this, but do you think that there will ever be an acceptance of gay marriage in any of the Christian faiths at all?
I don't think it's technically possible. I think marriage in Christianity is a sacrament. It's a union between one man, one woman, united under God, and it has a certain purpose. And it's not to say that is anti-gay people or anti-homosexuality. It is just that's the purpose of marriage. Gay people can live a happy, fulfilling life together without the sacrament of marriage.
Do you believe in civil marriage for gay people, if it's not ordained by any kind of church, but it's just called marriage in the eyes of whatever government there is?
I've always found that fascinating, because what was wrong with civil unions or civil partnerships? What does the word marriage mean to people that aren't of faith? Because to me, it's quite clear. It's a sacrament. It's very important, and it's something that brings us closer to each other and closer to God. But people who don't believe in that, why is that word so important?
I mean, that could be a question that you put to straight people who've had civil marriages as well, and it's about.
Oh, I absolutely would. Yeah, I don't see the point of it. I think if you're not of faith, you should just get a civil partnership, whether you're straight or gay. I think these rules should apply to people regardless of their sexuality.
But I'll tell you why. It's because, and you know what it is about the word. It is about the word. It's a lot about the word. You could tell me, as I consider you. You come on my show a lot, but I'm starting to consider you a bit of a friend as well, Calvin. I hope you don't mind me saying that. The feeling is mutual. And and I would want, if ever I were to perhaps get married and have a party in London, I would love you to come along to my fella. But the reason I would want it to be a marriage is because it's about the word, and it's about a word that I've been and others have been denied in the past, and it is an important word. And if I could have exactly the same rights with a civil partnership as I could with a marriage, religious or non-religious, but the fact that I am not allowed it based purely on my sexual orientation, it's inequality. It makes me feel slightly inferior. I think it makes other gay people feel slightly inferior. That's not to say I don't understand why perhaps those with a religious faith wouldn't want it to be within religion. I get that. But if there are other straight people who can get married in a way that it's called marriage without religion, it's not fair that I can't call mine a marriage. It's simply, and maybe it's semantics. Yeah. It's that
no, I
simple.
totally agree with you. I think if it's not religious, then maybe it shouldn't be called a marriage. Whether you're straight or gay, it doesn't matter. If it's a straight couple that don't believe in Christ,
well, then on that maybe you've got, or maybe on that you've got a point. But as long as it's all people who don't have that,
absolutely.
But then didn't marriage exist before religion?
Well, perhaps, but what we're touching on here is actually quite the principle of this, because quite often people assume that Christianity is a homophobic faith, and that is all down to this idea of marriage being one woman and one man, and for the idea of union and procreation and all of that stuff. But what it is actually about, it comes down to sex. That's what it comes down to. A lot of the times, this debate, in that people say, well, how come you don't think that gay people should have sex or sexual relations? I'm not sure what we're allowed to say on the air at this time.
Oh, you can. It's after 10 o'clock. Don't worry.
Okay, but it's not even that. Again, the law within our faith is universal. It's nobody should be having sex outside of marriage. And that's not to say that you're going to go to hell if you do. It's just, it's a sin. And in our faith, if you commit a sin, you repent. You go to confession and you get it off your chest, and you're absolved of that sin through the priest. And that accounts to men, women, gay, straight. It doesn't matter. But people just assume that it's anti-homosexual.
No, but I'll tell you again why that assumption is made. And it's because of the fact that for me to be able to do, say, having a fulfilling sex life, because I can't get married and have the term marriage within a religion, and I get why. I don't know if I love it, but I understand at least why, and kind of respect why. But because I'm not allowed it within a religion, I automatically, by doing what other people do within that faith, and that is have a fulfilling sex life, I automatically become a sinner, and there's no way for me to get around that. And that is why I think that there is a perception that because I do what you do, for instance, or what one does who is in a Christian faith and a Christian marriage, and I do exactly the same, I'm the sinner and they're not, because I'm not allowed to have marriage. And I think that, again, that gives the perception of discrimination or of homophobia. Now, it might not be meant that way. It might be meant in the most loving way possible. But I think that's why.
Well, you said that it makes you automatically a sinner. We're all automatically sinners. That's the one thing we all have.
But that's always the get out, Calvin, of people who are religious. It's always the get out. Well, we're all sinners, so it's kind of all right. But on that, I'm not the same sinner as you. I mean, I am a sinner, whereas you wouldn't be. If you met a lovely lady and got married to her in the church and then had a fulfilling sex life, and I met a lovely fella and got married, which I couldn't do in the church, you do your thing and you're okay. I do exactly the same thing and I'm a sinner. And the fact that everyone's sinners in other contexts doesn't change from that fact. And I think it's that gives the perception. And it might not be, and it might be in the most meant in the most kind way, but it's that gives the perception of homophobia.
Yeah. So, I mean, a straight man having sex outside of marriage would be sinning exactly the same way as a gay man outside of marriage. Yeah. But I'm with you in that there is that extra step. But they can rectify
that by getting married. I can't rectify that by getting married, because my marriage isn't recognised by you. And then so then being called a sinner, it grates a little, because then it makes me go, oh, okay, well, there's not much I can do about that, whereas you can. And I think that's where it stems from.
Yeah, but then that comes down to the individual's personal conscience, just as it does it with all the other sins of gluttony and pride and wrath, and the other sins we commit on a daily basis. It's down to our personal conscience on how far we go with those and how holy a life we live in accordance with Scripture.
And had you seen me at Gale's Bakery this weekend, gluttony would have been at the top of your list. Calvin Robinson, pleasure to talk to you. Really nice to actually have a civil conversation, even though we don't agree with all aspects of this.